You do the math here. At admission tickets averaging about $8, that's what the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, estimates ticket admissions are. That means about 4.3 billion admissions. Now, the population of the Earth is about 7 billion, a little over 7 billion. If you think about what this means, it means a number of people totaling more than half of the global population saw a movie in a theater last year. I think that's a very prevalent form of communication in our culture. Top movies gross between 300 and 600 billion, and in their both combined box office and DVD sales. Netflix, in the most recent numbers, has about 40 million subscribers globally, up by almost 10 million in just a few years. It's interesting to compare this to bestseller books. They typically sell between 20 and 40 million copies. So there are already more Netflix subscribers than buy the average bestseller. Lots of people, we can conclude, are watching films. Lots of people are watching TV shows, movies. What about the role of Christian films and TV shows in popular media? Well, thanks to Tolkien and Lewis, Christian-related films are included among the top 100 of all-time grossing movies. Lord of the Rings, Return of the King is number 7. The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey is number 16. Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers is number 25. Lord of the Rings, Fellowship is 33. Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is 52. If you're wondering why aren't they doing all of the Narnia stories, the producers from the start knew that the Narnia books sell in different quantities, and they filmed the movies in the order of the sales stats for the books, starting with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the sales have dropped with each of the films. The top film with explicitly Christian content is Passion of the Christ at number 80, with a total global box office of 612 million. Interesting to make a comparison here. That's less than a quarter of Avatar, the top grossing film's global box office. The Prince Caspian film comes far behind that at 167, with a total box of 419 million. There are a number of films, of course, in the top 100 that address spiritual and religious themes or include some consideration of questions of interest to Christians. We're going to look at some of those in a moment here. And you do find those in the top 500 and even some in the top 100. Again, an interesting point of comparison. Christians sometimes are not aware of the relationship of films that are explicitly targeted to a Christian audience versus the mainstream films that are explicitly marketed to Christians, such as Fireproof, Facing the Giants, Luther, we could go down the list. Those don't even appear in the top 500 if we're making a point of comparison. And that's not, of course, to say that they're bad films or that they shouldn't be done. I wouldn't say that at all. I don't want to be an anti-Christian art snob or something like that, right? So we want to grant the value of Christian films and even grant the value that they might have for apologetic purposes. But if we use that reference from Paul in Acts 17, notice what this means. The general public, the non-Christian public, is not watching Christian films. And so if we're trying to find cultural points of contact, it's interesting. I went to, Gonzaga actually sponsors a annual faith, film, and philosophy seminar with a small group of people, about 15 papers. And it's people who are largely Christian. And one of our seminars recently, I mentioned, I forget which one it was, I think it was Fireproof or Courageous maybe. And not a single person who was there had even heard of either of those films. And these are people who view films obsessively and write about films from a Christian point of view. So interesting that I'm sure most of us here are aware of those films, but it's probably surprising to you how many people are not even aware of those. All right, if we take Acts 17 as our point of reference, if we take what Paul is doing in Athens as a kind of model for us, what are Acts 17 uses for film and media for apologetic purposes? I'd say there are two obvious ones. First, what we want to do is use films to shed light on the assumptions and practices in contemporary culture. Remember, one of the things Paul did was wander around town and look and see, what do they do? Oh, there's this altar. There are lots of altars to gods that he found, but he found one in particular to the unknown God that told him something about their religious devotion and their practices. And secondly, he used those cultural tools as a point of contact for evangelism and apologetics. It gave him a reference in his discussion with the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. All right, let's take the first one of those. What can we learn about cultural assumptions and practices from contemporary film? One thing I've done recently, and there was a segment in the presentation I did in the breakout session last year about prayer. I started just thinking about, how does prayer appear in contemporary popular film? And the surprising thing is, once you start looking, you find it popping up everywhere. In Signs, the film I just showed the clip from, there are several instances where characters pray, and other films ranging from, let me reach back to Clint Eastwood, Pale Rider, to Robert Duvall's The Apostle, even the German indie film by Tom Tykwer, Run Lola Run. If you remember the last segment, if you know the film, she closes her eyes while she's running most of the film, but there's a segment where she closes her eyes and just starts to meditate, and it's pretty clear that she's praying. She says, I'm waiting, I'm waiting, I'm waiting. Basically a plea for help. And I think if we start tuning into things like this, we're going to see how do people in popular culture, of course, certainly we're thinking about how do screenwriters in Hollywood, but of course they're trying to capture and represent the way people think. How are people thinking about communication with God, about expectations for the conditions under which communication with God takes place? One clip recently from a work is Downton Abbey in the second season, if you're a Downton fan. Second season, episode 1, Lady Mary has come to realize that she loves Matthew Crawley, and he's off fighting in World War I, and she prays. And there's the way this segment works out is rather interesting. Let's take a look. It's a short clip here.
What do you want?
I think I left my book in here.
Is that all?
You were praying.
Don't be ridiculous.
You were praying? What were you praying for?
Please go, I'm tired. Dear Lord, I don't pretend to have much credit with you. I'm not even sure that you're there. But if you are, and if I've ever done anything good, I beg you to keep him safe.
I think it's lovely on multiple levels. We see first that she's embarrassed to be caught praying, right? And even though, of course, the film is set in the early 1900s, I think it captures the way many people today think about prayer. We are driven to prayer in moments of desperation. A person who's normally not religious would be embarrassed to be caught praying, even by a family member. And when people that don't know much about religion pray, they tend to think in transactional terms. Have I earned credit with you, God? Is there some balance in my account that I can draw on now to get you to do something for me? Very powerful way of thinking about how our culture thinks about prayer. Another interesting thing that we can learn from films is what it tells us about how we think about relationships. And I could go on and on and on about this. I'll just pick one of my pet peeves, and that's romantic comedies. Romantic comedies tell us a lot about what we think about relationships. A key idea is that romantic comedies tell us that emotions are our guide to determining how we ought to relate ourselves to other people romantically. Commitment is really not an important issue. If you think about the standard plot of a romantic comedy, the female character is in a relationship at the beginning of the film. We all realize that the jerk she's with is a terrible fit for her. It takes her a while longer to figure it out, but she meets someone who we can tell immediately is Mr. Right, and it takes her a while, and there are hijinks ensue and complications, but the plot eventually unfolds and resolves, and she dispenses with the old romantic partner that she has and signs up with the new one. I think it's interesting if you think about the message that we're getting from romantic comedies, if you put them end to end to end. What do you get? Well, you get serial monogamy, don't you? One relationship after another, after another, after another. And the guide or reference point for how we establish relationships is completely emotive, and it's not based on commitment. It's not based on a sense of a willing choice to sacrifice yourself to make a relationship work. I teach a summer course at Gonzaga every year on love and friendship, and it's interesting how much I see the attitudes of the students reflect what they see in romantic comedies, because the first question I ask out of the gate before we read any material for the course is, what's your definition of love? And without fail, and again, this may be surprising to a Christian audience, without fail, their initial definition is, love is an emotion. Love is a feeling. And we see that in romantic comedies. Second point, okay, so first point of contact, our first way that we can use films in an Acts 17 way is to find information about our culture. Second point of contact, or the second application is as a point of contact for apologetics. Paul used his knowledge of that altar to the unknown God as a way to frame a conversation about their religious practices and to relate Christian theological ideas to them in a way that could connect with what was familiar to them. I would say that contemporary media offers us multiple such opportunities. In the program, the title for my talk is Signs of Grace in Contemporary Film. That's what I'm talking about, but I also titled it Idols to an Ill-Known God, because I think if we make the point of comparison to Paul here, he found an altar to an unknown God. The Athenians were trying to cover their theological bases, right? And we worship, the Athenians were quite prolific in their willingness to worship, right? They were willing to accommodate any deity. If you know Plato's Republic, for example, the framing dramatic event for the dialogue is a new goddess is being introduced. The cult of a new goddess is being introduced into Athens. And so it's not surprising that the Athenians would have an altar to an unknown God. The altar that I find in contemporary media is to an ill-known God, because we find references to theological and spiritual matters. We find points of connection to ideas about Christianity and about other religions for that matter. But often they are superficial, simplified, barely worked out. Now, there are films, of course, with explicitly religious themes and imagery. You think of maybe a crossover film like Amazing Grace, which was produced by Walden Media, the group that initially produced the Narnia movies, or co-produced them. But also films like Shadowlands, The Tree of Life. I'm a Terrence Malick fan. I know some people find Terrence Malick insufferable, but The Tree of Life is a deeply religious film, a deeply Christian film. And I've mentioned Robert Duvall's Apostle, the story of a evangelical, a Pentecostal pastor down here in Louisiana. You also find spiritual or metaphysical themes, which several of our speakers, if you notice, have talked about the weaknesses and the challenges to naturalism that we see in the culture around us. I think one place that we see this, a probing at the weak points of naturalism and materialism, is this interest that we find in supernatural themes in films like The Sixth Sense and other M. Night Shyamalan film, or Clint Eastwood's Hereafter, which I know that's not a film a lot of people liked, and probably a lot of Christians may be put off by it because it has themes of the occult. There's a character Matt Damon plays, a person who's a medium who connects with dead people. But I think one thing that's interesting about the film Hereafter is that it is explicitly raising the possibility of human survival after death in a materialistic culture. And yeah, there's weird stuff thrown in there, I would grant that. But there's a point of contact between two of the characters where one of them is very clearly atheistic, materialistic, and one who's had a near-death experience, which again was a topic of a talk recently here at the conference. She asked the other character, "What do you think happens when we die?" And he says, "Well, when we die, your body rots. That's it. That's the end of you." And she's had this near-death experience, and she thinks that's just not enough. I know there's something else. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to think about it even. So in a film like that, we're being at least exposed to the possibility of spiritual realities that go beyond the present. And we also find often in films discussions about meaning, value, and the meaning of life. For example, in this clip from Contact.
I read your book.
Here we go.
Would you like me to quote you? Ironically, the thing that people are the most hungry for, meaning, is the one thing that science hasn't been able to give them.
Yeah.
Come on. It's like you're saying that science killed God. What if science simply revealed that he never existed in the first place?
I think we're gonna need to get some air.
What?
And a few more of these.
Thank you. Whew. A little chilly out here.
Yeah, this is nice.
I got one for you.
What do you got?
Occam's Razor. You've ever heard of it?
Occam's Razor. It sounds like some slasher movie.
No, Occam's Razor. It's a basic scientific principle. And it says, all things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the right one.
Makes sense to me.
All right. So what's more likely? Thank you.
You're welcome.
An all-powerful, mysterious God created the universe and then decided not to give any proof of his existence. Or that he simply doesn't exist at all. And that we created him so we wouldn't have to feel so small and alone.
I don't know. I couldn't imagine living in a world where God didn't exist. I wouldn't want to.
How do you know you're not deluding yourself? I mean, for me, I'd need proof.
Proof. Did you love your father?
What?
Your dad, did you love him?
Yes, very much.
Prove it.
The first clip I showed was from Signs, a film written and directed by a Hindu. This is a film based on a book by famous atheist Carl Sagan. And we might say, as believers, the religious character played by Matthew McConaughey is drawn rather crudely because it looks like he's going in the direction of articulating faith in fideistic terms, right? Where don't you have things that you count on and trust that you can't prove, that you have no proof for? But isn't it interesting, even in the way even if we would say that's not a very clear presentation of the religious view, that we're getting a contrast, and it's depicted in that way, that science doesn't provide all the answers. So the religious character played by McConaughey is at least trying to articulate the limits of what we would call a scientistic outlook, the claim that science answers all of our questions about meaning and value. There are a number of other important themes that are related to Christianity that we find treated in popular films, and I could have had in fact, I had a longer list, but these are some important issues and films that treat them, like appearance and reality. Of course, as believers, we want to say what we see is not all that's real. And there are a number of films that address this point: The Matrix, Dark City, Inception, Vanilla Sky. We know that we are sinful, and our sinfulness often works its way out in deception, especially self-deception. We lie to ourselves about ourselves. A number of films treat issues like that: Memento, Shutter Island. Questions about loss, sin, guilt, and ultimately redemption. I could have put a list of probably 50 or 80 or 100 films for this one, but you think of films like Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven or Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, which an important driving theme of all three of those films is this sense of loss that Bruce Wayne has for having lost his parents at an early age, and also this sense of guilt that he feels about that loss, and a lack of clarity about who he is and how he's going to find his way in the world. Themes about choice and action, again, this is just central to film narratives. Who am I? What kind of life am I going to lead? What choices am I going to make? And sometimes, of course, films is able to present themes that address questions of choice in a very creative way. I've mentioned Tom Tykwer's film, Run, Lola, Run, which is a fascinating film because what it does is present a series of scenarios in which the character gets to try several times to get things right. My daughter wrote a thesis, an undergraduate senior thesis on Run, Lola, Run, and she came up with a brilliant idea that was so brilliant. I read it, and then I was talking to a colleague later, and I said, I read this brilliant paper in which someone said that the way you should read Run, Lola, Run is it's like a video game where you reset the game until you master the level. And it was my daughter. She had written that. So great insight about the film Run, Lola, Run. And also, of course, questions about choice, action, principles, ethics, the conditions under which we make choices, how we should think about our relationships to others, whether sacrifice is demanded of us. There are multitudes of films that address questions like that. And indeed, many of them often do so with very explicit Christian imagery. Another M. Night Shyamalan film, The Village, which is not as popular as some of his other movies, but it's essentially a group of people who try to make a technical solution, or they try to construct a technical solution to the problem of evil. And they do that by recreating a religious community of about 100 years ago. Sorry, I'm trying to minimize the spoiler alerts, but I won't say any more about that. The film Gattaca addresses the question of identity and choice in a dystopian context where there is a genetic determinism is the model of thinking in that culture. Les Miserables, there are several good film versions, and the musical version that just came out last year, of course, it's centered on the sacrificial and kind act of a Christian cleric that frames and sets up the development of the main character. Gran Torino, there's a key. Actually, there are several religious things. There's a character who's a priest that the main character, Walt Kowalski, played by Clint Eastwood, interacts with throughout the film. But there's an amazing scene toward the end of the film where Walt, who has made friends with a Hmong neighbor, he's dealing with, again, I'm not going to say much about the plot not to mess it up if you haven't seen it, but there's an act of violence that's been committed against a family member, and the young neighbor has been taken under Walt's wing, and he wants Walt to help him go engage in an act of revenge. And Walt locks him into his basement. And there's this, strangely enough, I mean, most people, their basement doors are wooden doors or something like that. In the film, the door is a screen, and Walt starts talking to Tao, is the boy's name, through the screen, and it exactly replicates another scene in the film where Walt is talking to the priest in the confession box. So you have this confession that takes place in church, and then there's another confession that takes place between Walt and the young man. And the Bourne series, I was thinking especially about the most recent one, Bourne Legacy, where there's a scene where the character has been forced to do something terrible, and another character talks to him about this and says, "Don't you realize that we're sin eaters? That we have to play this role." They're, of course, CIA-type agents, and they have to do terrible things in order to protect ordinary people. And so there are these questions about who am I? What do I want to do? What are the conditions of my action? We find those all over in film. And of course, in many cases, those questions get asked in ways that connect directly to Christian concerns. Often films, we've already talked about, the first point is that films tell us about our culture. Often films make points of contact that raise questions about cultural assumptions. I think a really interesting example of this is the quite bizarre TV series Breaking Bad. And I've mentioned already that romantic comedies reflect this view that's prevalent in our culture, that relationships are built on emotion. If you look at Breaking Bad really carefully, I think something very strange is going on. The producers and writers of the show intentionally at the beginning of the show push viewers into sympathetic identification with the main character, Walter White. So we emotively, sympathetically connect with him. He's been diagnosed with a terminal illness. He's very unhappy in his job teaching chemistry to high schoolers. In fact, he had promise as a brilliant researcher, but that didn't pan out. His relationship with his family is okay in some respects, but troubled and problematic in other respects. So we're supposed to identify with him sympathetically. But of course, the trajectory of the film, even if you haven't seen it, if you've heard about it, is he decides to care for his family, provide for his family in the event of his death by becoming a meth cook and then a meth dealer. And the film purposely, I think, after that it creates that identification with him, it makes him look worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point where I think the producers and writers are essentially asking the audience, we made you like this guy. Are you happy with that? Do you really think you ought to like this guy? Is it the case that your emotive connection with him is something you think is a good idea? So there's a questioning there of this whole idea of emotive basis for relationships. And in the face of that whole thing that we see in romantic comedies. There's a recent movie, I won't say what it is because it would mess up an element of the plot, but there's a recent film out in which we are, by the narrative, by the way the story develops, we are meant to identify a character as the perfect romantic partner for another of the characters in the film. But as it turns out, he turns out to be a creep. And that's again a case where these assumptions that operate are being called into question by the film. So sometimes we not only see cultural ideas and assumptions reflected in film, we often see them interrogated or questioned in ways that provide a real pathway for conversation. Really what I'm talking about is doing what we might call film apologetics. That is, using film as a tool in the way that Paul used the statue, the altar to the unknown God, and used Stoic poetry, where we use the concrete narrative of film to explore human experience in a way that shows the relevance, meaning, and plausibility of the Christian worldview. Notice we sometimes do it by noticing, as we've talked about just now, we've talked about elements in films that we would say, I want to identify with this, or do you see how this is pointing us in the direction of a Christian worldview idea? In some cases, it's going to be a clear contrast, as the Jodie White character in Contact, right? She's the scientific, atheistic rationalist, or hyper-rationalist, we might say. What we I think can do or try to do is use film to show the fit of Christian belief with human practice and human experience. In other words, film often represents for us a way of living. We would say in Christian apologetic circles, we would say often films capture and represent worldviews, right? And with film, we're able to say, in a way that connects to, again, a lot of what we've heard here at the conference. We've heard that many people are driven away from the faith, not by arguments, but by emotion and by experiences in their lives. Notice films give us very concrete points of reference to say, is something like this happening in your life? Is something like this happening? Does this resonate with your experience? Is this a character you would identify with? Are the choices that this character made choices that seem reasonable or just or fair or right to you? And if not, why not? I might even say, if we think about Lewis's idea about how story and narrative has its power and value insofar as it represents the true myth, the true myth where God became human and died and rose again to reconcile him to himself. Stories in various ways point to and connect with that true myth. We often can use what Andrew Fellows has called subversive apologetics, where we rattle the cage of the worldview of a non-Christian. I think a film like Contact enables us to do that, where we can say, do you really hold a view like the Jodie Foster character? Is that the way you think about what religion is? Or even better, we could say, do you think of religion in the way the Matthew McConaughey character does, where it's just a matter of faith and you believe things that you don't necessarily have evidence for? And we can draw out implications and assumptions of worldview beliefs in a way that highlights their problems. There's a sense in which we might talk about the difference between a logical reductio ad absurdum, that is, taking an assumption and showing its ridiculous implications. And we might talk about something similar, a kind of experiential reductio ad absurdum. And often films do this. I mentioned Memento, which is a case of a guy who has a memory impairment, but he finds out that he's actually set himself up to do something terrible. And there's a point at which he can make a choice that he will later not know the implications of. It's a very convoluted movie, by the way. And the film is actually constructed in a way to replicate the character's experience. But it's a case where we can say, if you faced a situation where you could set yourself on the path to a choice that you knew was wrong, but you also knew that you wouldn't have to face the consequences consciously of having made that wrong choice? Would you do that? I think one thing that's really fascinating in recent films is there's a theme that, like prayer, I see popping up everywhere. Another theme that I see popping up in multiple places is the idea of what Nietzsche called the death of God, the collapse of values, the onset of nihilism, the collapse of traditional values. There's this nagging sense in many films that not all is well with modernity, that something is wrong. And sometimes you see that explicitly worked out in apocalyptic films like The Road and Book of Eli, which are very dark and depressing and pessimistic. You see it in dystopian films like the enormously popular Hunger Games series, Elysium, the TV series Revolution, and even in the zombie genre. I don't know if many of you listen to the Breakpoint radio program, and often there are really good ideas on there. I heard one, it was in I think it was a few months back, where they were talking about the series The Walking Dead, which is one of a number of zombie films and series that are popular now. But their argument was that zombie films are an attack on Christianity because they're a parody of the resurrection. Of course, you have beings that are semi-alive but not really alive, so it's almost like a satirical parody of the resurrection. I don't think actually that's what's going on in The Walking Dead. What I think is going on in The Walking Dead and lots of other zombie-type films and these apocalyptic thrillers and dystopias is this sense that values as we have experienced them, values as they were promised to us by modernity, are in collapse. And we find ourselves in the broken detritus of Western culture. Of course, I mean, most of us would look at a film like that and say it's just entertainment. We look around, we open the door of the theater and we go out and everything's just fine. But notice what they're metaphorically capturing is this sense that our culture, the sense that the things that we count on and trust can't be trusted because they could very well fall into collapse and not be there when we need them. I was going to say something earlier, so I mentioned the unholy trinity of profanity, sex, and violence. I think this is a theme, a problem that Christian apologists have to think about. You have to think about what are you willing to watch, and we have different views about this. We could have a discussion about that. If we want to have some questions during the question time, we could talk about this. But of course, the Scripture does give us instructions about avoiding what's evil, and we need to be careful about that and careful about exposing us to things that, as I just heard someone say the other day, you can't unwatch certain things, right? So you want to be careful about what you put into your mind. But we also at the same time need to be we need to be culturally informed in the way that Paul was, that when he talked to Stoic philosophers, he was able to quote Stoic poetry as a point of connection. Now, I say that because the film The Gray, I want to show you actually two clips from The Gray. The Gray is, on one level, it's a horror movie because it's a survival story about a group of people who survive a plane crash and then deal with a pack of wolves that pursue them across the Alaskan landscape. But I think on a deeper level, it actually is addressing exactly this theme I'm talking about the death of God. We see the problem set up in a scene that occurs right at the time of the plane crash. The main character, by the way, it's Liam Neeson plays the main character, John Otway, and it's very jarring to see Aslan cursing prolifically and and doing all sorts of other stuff. But anyway, that just shows you the range of roles that Liam Neeson is willing to take. But when this crash occurs, without trying to say too much about the film, the main character, John Otway, has lost his wife, and he sees the world as very bleak and depressing. The job that he has is shooting wolves that threaten the workers on an oil rig in the far north of Alaska. And he identifies more with the wolves than he does with the people he works with. But when the plane is about to crash, there's a moment where he imaginatively goes back to thinking about the warm embrace of his wife, and he thinks about that. And then, just as Nietzsche talked about the death of God, cultural assumptions are in collapse, he experiences this directly in a kind of metaphorical way. Now, if you notice the filmmaker, we might say if you're an engineer or know much about the mechanics of airplane crashes, you probably would look at that and say, this is completely unlikely. Right before the crash takes place, we actually see him in the plane buckle himself into his seat, and then he leans over and buckles his upper body into a second seat. So he's actually buckled in to two seats. And he survives the crash, but you notice when he's jarred out of that imaginative moment with his wife, and he stands up, and we have that long shot from the camera, and notice what the filmmaker is explicitly telling us. You are all alone in a hostile environment. And he actually pans around to look at the landscape, and he eventually finds the plane crash. We see that. But I think the filmmaker is specifically hinting to us that what this is really about, it's not just about a plane crash. It's not ultimately just about wolves. It's about the condition that we find ourselves in not those of us in this room, I should say, but it's the condition that many people in our culture find themselves in. They wake up, they have a tragedy in their life. Someone dies, someone they care about. A relationship is torn apart. And they wake up and stand up, and all they see is a horrific, terrible landscape with no help in sight anywhere. The grave visually inquires, are we left alone after the catastrophe? Most importantly, are there divine resources to aid us? A sub-theme of the film is there are characters who are religious, and this small group of people who survived the crash. There are characters who are religious. There are characters who are actually hostile to religion. And we see something very interesting in another clip that's toward the end of the film. Again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the plot development, but given the bad language, I had to be very careful about cutting just a piece here. But near the end of the film, the main character, John Otway, played by Liam Neeson, in a moment of desperation, prays to heaven. And I think it's fascinating. I've mentioned already that we look for, I encourage you to look for prayer in popular films, but take a look at how this prayer pans out.
Show me something real. I need it now, not later. Now. Show me and I'll believe in you till the day I die. I swear. I'm calling on you. I'm calling on you.
Did you catch the look on his face in those moments? He falls back, and you see there's anger. Gary Habermas was just talking about atheists angrily who are angry at God, right? And in this case, John Otway, the character, is not an atheist so much as he is someone who's so overwhelmed by the problem of evil, the loss of his wife, that he doesn't really have any grounds for trusting God. But here, he's essentially saying, he's challenging God. I need you so desperately. And you see in the look on his face, I think is to a believer, it's horrific. This sense that I make an overture and the hidden God remains hidden and his face just falls. Now, we might find that just depressing, but I think there's something very powerful about, even in a film that refuses to endorse the religious solution to the human problem, the religious solution cannot be left alone. That we find this sense that people are going to reach out to God even if they can't find him, even if God to them remains elusive or hidden. It really is making a claim about human nature. We seek God even when our experience is to find him hidden. That's a truth about ourselves. And it's one that I think, especially if we're thinking about this emotive dimension of apologetics, it's something we should know about the people that we minister to, the people that we communicate with. In an essay, Ron Austin says that modernity faces a crisis of disbelief. Notice, not a crisis of belief, it's a crisis of disbelief. And Austin argues that it's a crisis that we find central to a lot of depictions of meaning issues in Hollywood films. He says, this is not simply a turning away from traditional religion. That happened a generation ago. If you're thinking about depictions of religion in popular film, films like the Apostle, the Robert Duvall film about the Pentecostal, are very rare, where you have a sympathetic presentation of a Christian character. And Austin says that's what we get from Hollywood these days. But what's the crisis of disbelief? The modern crisis comes from the loss of belief in the alternatives to religious faith. And so I think what we see is this grasping, groping sense that there's something there and the alternatives available to us are not giving us what we need. And so even in a film, in the end, the gray is really a contrast between, it's interesting if we go back to Paul here, because it's a contrast between theism and Stoicism. There's a poem that was written by the character Otway's father that he refers to time and time again, once more into the fray, into the last good fight I'll ever know. Live and die on this day, I think is what he says. So there's this sense of I can, and in fact in the line that I had to chop right after this because the language gets pretty bad, he just says, I'll do it myself. So he prays to heaven, he reaches out, God remains hidden and silent, and he says, I'm not going to count on you anymore. So we get this contrast between Stoicism and theism. But I think it's interesting, in the light of Austin's comment here, that we see even when there's a clear contrast and even when a character makes a choice, there's a sense that that choice is often inadequate for us. That we know that many people make a Stoic choice. Many people make a new atheist choice. But they also have a nagging sense, that's not enough for me. That isn't enough to provide what I need. The crisis of disbelief means that there is space to explore spiritual and even traditional religious answers to the modern crisis of meaning. And we see this popping up in all different kinds of places in films, some of which I've mentioned already, like The Apostles' Signs, Hereafter, Book of Eli, Tree of Life, To the Wonder, another Terrence Malick film, and even the recent Gravity, which I won't spoil by making any further comments. But if you haven't seen Gravity, it's a beautiful film. It's really worth seeing. Thus we find signs of grace present even in, I would say, very dark contemporary film and popular media. Even where there's darkness, I think there are hints and signs of grace. In some cases, the grace is not merely a sign. In the amazing film Tree of Life, for example, it's clear that the film is arguing, there's an argument to the film, that nature is infused with divine grace. And if we are open to what God is doing in the world, it can change our lives. But in other films, it may be much more subtle, like in The Gray, where it's just this hint that my saying that I'm going to take responsibility and do things myself is not adequate for my own experience. These signs of grace suggest to me that there's a third possibility of applying Acts 17 and Acts 17 attitude toward contemporary film. And that is often, I know this sounds very radical and revolutionary, but often we might find, if we're watching carefully, that contemporary films, even contemporary secular films, can delight, wonder, and even spiritually nourish us. Open to spiritual answers to the modern condition means that there's a way that films can speak to us. And hear what I'm thinking about. If you go back to the story about Paul, of course, we've noticed that Paul wandered around Athens, saw the idols to various gods. He saw the altar to the unknown God. He had already studied Stoic poetry such that when he had a conversation with those Stoic philosophers, he was able to draw that out of his memory. Radical idea here. All truth is God's truth. All art that reflects and speaks to the human condition is Christian art, I would say. Actually, Bob made a comment about Jake Smith and the band and Christian art as we often separate it off, and the broader sense of how art can speak to us and how we as Christians can speak artistically to the world. In Lewis's formulation, in an amazing little article called Talking About Bicycles, bizarre title, the disenchantment of modernity prepares us, sets us up to be enchanted by literary or cinematic wonder. If we are open, if we are ready to be affected by art and how it speaks to the human condition, then it cannot merely be an instrumental tool for us to use in apologetics. It can speak to us and nourish us. This wonder is evoked in us as our desires are given imaginative form. And I'm thinking here of Tolkien's famous essay on fairy stories, where he talks about enchantment as the objective of fairy stories. And by that, he means, of course, an awakening to something that is beyond our immediate experience, something that points us to a deeper and richer reality. And there's a lovely clip I'll end with from Lord of the Rings Two Towers, in which the characters Sam and Frodo are talking about this very point, about story and narrative and how it nourishes and speaks to us. Oops. Hit the wrong button, sorry.
I can't do this, Sam. I know. It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here. But we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing. This shadow, even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going. Because they were holding on to something. What are we holding on to, Sam? That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
We don't have to look very carefully to see that Sam is talking about the theological virtue of hope. That's really what he's talking about. And of course, from a Christian point of view, hope does not mean wishful thinking about some happy circumstance in the future. Hope is a confidence. As he says, in the greatest stories, there's darkness, but there's also a sense that there's something beyond that. I challenge you, there's another theme that if you look, you'll begin to see again and again and again in contemporary films, and that's the theme of hope. The second Hunger Games film is new enough that I couldn't get a clip of it, but there's a wonderful scene where the main character, Katniss, is talking to her sister, and her sister says, "Something has changed." Again, it's a dystopian story, terrible political regime that forces people to do these spectacles to pacify the masses. But her sister says, since you won in the Hunger Games, something has changed. And she says, hope. That's what's different. I think there are two key steps for this last step, and this is one that I think we do have to, as believers, be cautious about how we consume and make use of popular film. Lewis challenges us when we encounter a work of art in his great work, Experiment in Criticism. He challenges us to open ourselves to the work of art and let it speak to us on its own terms. And I kind of see that in Paul's wandering through the streets of Athens. He's letting the city of Athens tell him who is Athens, what are the Athenians like. But of course, there's also an element of critical appropriation. It tells us that Paul was deeply troubled by all of those idols that he saw. And as believers, I think also we want to appropriate critically. We want to let works of art speak to us. We want to give them a chance to communicate something to us. But as believers, of course, we want to measure that against the truth that's revealed to us through Scripture. So, thank you.
I know some of you can talk about movies, your favorite movies, for weeks. But come on up. Ask your question. Oh, Andrew is at the front of the line. Hello.
Okay, so you've